Hello, class. Professor Vanderbilt back, ready to talk more about the election of 1912. This is lecture number 14 for History 102. Now, let's review where we left off. The Republican Party, which has been split in two, has nominated President Taft to run for his second term. The Democrat Party has nominated the rising star of the Democrat Party, Woodrow Wilson. Now, by this point, the progressives have formed their own political party outright instead of just being a wing of the Democrats or a wing of the Republicans. And it appeared in the beginning of 1912 that their first ever candidate to run for the presidency would be our old buddy, the governor of Wisconsin, Fighting Bob La Follette. But when they hold the Progressive Party's national convention in Chicago, Theodore Roosevelt and a lot of progressive Republicans who have sort of stormed out of the Republican convention earlier were disgruntled with the Republican Party and the influence that big business had on it, come to the Progressive Party and their convention in Chicago. So Theodore Roosevelt lets it be known that if they want to nominate him to be the progressive candidate for the presidency, he's willing to come out of retirement. So, once the progressives figure that out, Fighting Bob La Follette steps aside quite willingly, knowing that Roosevelt stands a much better chance of being elected than he does, and the famous reformer and champion of the poor and board member of the NAACP, Jane Addams, takes the stage and nominates Theodore Roosevelt to be their candidate for the presidency of the United States. And it's a unanimous selection by the progressives. So Theodore Roosevelt takes the stage to make his famous acceptance speech. Now, one thing that had been kind of going on behind the scenes, and this was at the Republican convention, big business critics of Roosevelt who just didn't want him there because they disliked his stance against business and whatnot, were sort of floating around the rumor that Roosevelt was too old to be president of the United States. Now, Theodore Roosevelt in 1912 is 54 years old. In the present election of 2020, he'd be a spring chicken among all the candidates. And they're trying to claim he's too old. He's been around a while, but we must remember when he was sworn in as president in 1901, he was 42 years old. So, Roosevelt tries to deflect these criticisms about him being old, and he makes a very famous statement in this acceptance speech at the Progressive Convention in Chicago that will give the party its nickname. Because he will say, quote, "I feel as strong as a bull moose." And because of that, that's why the Progressive Party, especially in the election of 1912, becomes known as the Bull Moose Party. And the head of a bull moose becomes their symbol. So if you're ever at a garage sale and see a little lapel pin of a moose, buy it. That's from the election of 1912. I own several. Now, so Roosevelt becomes the progressive candidate, And then, of course, once again, we got the perennial socialist candidate, Eugene Debs, running also. So we have four major candidates in this election. And this election is going to be very hard fought. Taft really won't campaign that much because, as we know, he shies away from the limelight. Woodrow Wilson will give it his all, and he'll be out on the campaign trail talking about his platform, which he calls the New Freedom Platform. And as we'll find out, targeted in this New Freedom Platform is something that he's going to label the triple wall of privilege, which we'll talk about in a little bit here. Theodore Roosevelt is going to campaign like a madman. He's going to get some of the old Rough Riders to join him back on the campaign trail, and he'll be traveling across the country as the progressive or bull moose candidate. Now, what's going to happen here is there's going to be a big, gigantic progressive rally held for Roosevelt in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, about a month before Election Day. And it's going to be a really giant celebration of the progressives. Obviously, that's Fighting Bob La Follette's home state, the Wisconsin idea. And he's organized this big, giant weekend celebration. And ultimately, Theodore Roosevelt will be the keynote speaker. So Roosevelt is making his way to an open-air stage in a park where he's going to deliver this keynote speech for this giant rally. And on the way there, Roosevelt's limousine gets stuck in traffic because everyone and their brother in Milwaukee is going to attend this big event. Roosevelt gets nervous that he's going to be late for his appearance, so he tells his advisors, forget it. I'm going to get out and walk the rest of the way to the stage in the park. So he does, and on his way there, a madman in the crowd pulls out a gun and shoots Roosevelt in the chest. Now, the gunshot knocks Roosevelt down. Roosevelt gets back up to his feet, stunned, and he reaches into his pocket and pulls out a handkerchief. He immediately coughs into the handkerchief. The reason why, the bullet has entered into his shoulder, and he wants to make sure that it hasn't hit his lung. So he coughs to make sure that it hasn't, and when he doesn't cough up any blood, that convinces him the bullet has not entered his lung. So Roosevelt sort of dusts himself off and continues and makes it to the stage where he's going to deliver his speech, all the time holding that handkerchief over the gunshot wound in his shoulder. Now, when he gets up on the stage, he's overheated from all this, walking. It's a nice fall day. He's obviously walked, been shot. So he takes off his suit coat. When he takes off his suit coat, the crowd gasps because his white dress shirt was completely soaked in blood. Now, Roosevelt basically tries to calm down the crowd and says, don't worry, it's not a serious wound. And then he goes on to deliver the entire text of his speech. That speech becomes known as the famous Bloody Shirt speech. After he finishes the speech, he's then whisked off to the hospital where the surgeons there will determine what really saved his life and what stopped that bullet from entering his lung. In his vest pocket, because the wound was on his right side. In his vest pocket, he had two things when the assassin's bullet hit him. He had his eyeglass case, which was made of metal, and he had his speech, which he had printed up and had it hard bound into like a little book so he could carry it in his vest pocket, then take it out on the podium and read it there instead of carrying a bunch of papers. And remember, you don't have any teleprompters or anything like that today, that we have today. The bullet first hit the eyeglass case, then went up instead of straight into his lung, went through his speech, then up into the muscle in his shoulder. Now, that is why the gunshot was not fatal. But unfortunately, because Roosevelt was bullheaded, as usual, he lost a tremendous amount of blood. And that's going to disable him for a 2-week period in the heat of the election. And a lot of critics argue that probably is what cost him the election, because he lost 2 valuable weeks on the campaign trail. And now these claims that Roosevelt's old, weak, or whatever, a lot of people didn't know, how is he going to recover from this gunshot wound and so forth. His health becomes a question. Now, if you're interested in seeing that that eyeglass case with the bullet hole in it, his speech that was hardbound with the bullet hole through it, and the shirt he wore that day, all 3 items, luckily, have been preserved and are on display at the Roosevelt birthplace in Manhattan, the Brownstone, which is a national park near Union Square. It's on display there. It's pretty amazing that it still exists, and I was stunned to see it when I visited that site. So, back to the results of the election. Now, if you look in your book on page 672, we have the election results. And as you'll notice, Woodrow Wilson was the victor in this election. He is going to receive almost 42% of the popular vote, which translates to about 6.3 million. Theodore Roosevelt will finish second, receiving an impressive 4.1 million votes. And what's even more impressive is he'll receive 88 Electoral College votes. That's the highest total, still to this day, of Electoral College votes for a third-party candidate. Because remember, he's the progressive candidate. Taft will finish a disappointing third with about 3.5 million votes and a measly 8 Electoral College votes. And Eugene Debs will have a pretty respectable showing, garnering over 900,000 votes. So, but the end result is Woodrow Wilson is elected President of the United States, but he only received 42% of the popular vote. That translates to 58% of the people voted for somebody else. So that makes Woodrow Wilson what's known as, in political circles, a minority candidate. He did not receive a majority of the vote. So, Woodrow Wilson knows from day one he's got his work cut out for him if he wants to be reelected president in 1916, because there was 58% of the people that voted for somebody else, which will make him ripe for defeat. So, with that in mind, Woodrow Wilson is going to make a very important inaugural day speech in March of 1913. The name of this speech is going to be known, it's going to become known as the triple wall of privilege speech. And this whole concept and this idea was the brainchild of his top advisor in his first term, a man by the name of Louis Brandeis, who we'll be talking about. So Wilson talks about in his Inauguration Day speech that there's a triple wall of privilege that exists in the United States that needs to be torn down one by one. One of the triple walls is the still very high tariff. It only benefits big business, and consumers are the ones who pay the price. The second wall of privilege is the antiquated banking system that was developed during the Civil War and is way outdated and needs to be modernized for all Americans. Then finally, he argues, the third wall of privilege are the trusts and monopolies that have skirted the Sherman Antitrust Act. So he argues we need new legislation that'll enable his administration to go after these remaining trusts and monopolies. So that, as far as he's concerned, is this triple wall of privilege that still exists in America that it's his duty to tackle. Now, what he's going to do next is, some would call it a political stunt, others would call it political genius. Typically, what happens after a president delivers his Inauguration Day speech, there'll be a luncheon that immediately follows. And at that luncheon, leadership of Congress from both sides of the aisle will have lunch with the president in the Capitol, because the inauguration takes place on the steps of the Capitol building, as most of you know, with the crowd out in the mall. Then after that luncheon is the Inauguration Day parade, where the parade will go down Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol to the White House, its destination. Woodrow Wilson, at the end of his speech, makes a stunning announcement. And he basically says there's no time for fun and celebration. These problems of the triple wall of privilege are so pressing that he needs to get to work on them right now, today. So he tells Congress, that's all seated out in front of him as the immediate audience of the speech, that he is right then and there calling a special session of Congress, and that they are to follow him into the Capitol, where he's going to address a joint session, special session of Congress, because they need to get to work today, not tomorrow. So he forgoes his parade in this, gesture that hasn't been done since President Adams did that in 1801. But he's trying to get across to the American public that he's a man of action. He's there to get things done. Plus, he's trying to build support. Remember, he only won 42% of the vote. He needs to get up to over 50% to win in a two-person race in the future. So, he'll go in, he'll address Congress on the first wall of privilege, the tariffs. And he tells Congress they have to get to work immediately. Tariffs have been too high for too long for no reason, and it's so pressing that something needs to be done now, not sometime in the future. So, Congress will go right to work, and very quickly, they will pass a law, the Underwood Tariff Act of 1913. This is going to be the first significant cut to tariffs in over 19 years. And it's going to be sort of across the board 15% cut on all tariffs. And in order to make up for that lost revenue, because remember, the United States government, this is how they collected the revenue that they spent in the federal budget through tariffs. Remember when the billion-dollar Congress spent too much in 1890, they had to increase the tariff with the McKinley Tariff Act, and because they'd spent too much. So to replace that lost revenue, which would be significant, part of the Underwood Tariff Act was our first ever income tax. Now, there had been an attempt to pass an income tax during the Cleveland administration, and when they did, the Supreme Court had ruled it unconstitutional. So shortly before this, in 1912, the 16th Amendment had been added to the U.S. Constitution. Now, you can look at it for yourself in the back of your book. Remember, you got a copy of the Constitution in the appendix. But what it does is it makes income taxes constitutional. So we have our first ever graduated income tax. Now, this is sort of apropos because next week is April 15th, which is typically tax day in America, but that's been, put forward, I think, 3 months or whatever. I didn't pay any attention. I just paid mine on time. But the very first income tax was the following. It created two tax brackets. First of all, if you didn't make $3,000 or more per year, which the overwhelming majority of Americans did not, you didn't pay any taxes. So, in reality, this first income tax, most people didn't care about because it didn't affect them. If you made $3,000 or more, you fell into the first tax bracket. You had to pay 1% federal income taxes. I believe the lowest tax bracket that exists today is 15%. I might be wrong, but I believe it's either 12 or 15, I don't know. But it's not 1. Then, if you made $20,000 or more, you fell into the other tax bracket. Very few Americans made $20,000 or more. That meant you had to pay 2% income tax. And believe it or not, you had people screaming bloody murder, claiming this was a communist plot and it was the end of America as we know it. Obviously, today, the highest tax brackets are up in the 35, 40 percentile range. And that's just federal. So, critics were wrong, obviously. This wasn't the end of the world. Now, the next thing that's going to happen here, as far as the triple wall of privilege is concerned, Wilson will go right back into action after they pass the Underwood Tariff Act. He'll call another special session of Congress because it was getting into the spring and they were getting ready to have their traditional recess, which back in this day and age, Congress always went on recess in May, as you might remember, late May, because it was too damn hot in Washington to stay in session. It's early spring, and Woodrow Wilson tells them, you got to get something accomplished before you go on recess. And if you don't, I'm going to call a special session, and I'll keep you here all summer long if I have to. And the next wall of privilege, as you'll remember, is the banking laws in America. We were still operating under the Civil War National Banking Act, passed as an emergency measure during the middle of the Civil War. Obviously, the economy in America had changed tremendously since then. So, Congress will hear Wilson's pleas, and they know he means business, and they don't want to stay there all summer. So they're going to pass the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. This is the same law that our banking system operates under today. Obviously, it's been reformed from time to time, but we still have the Federal Reserve, and this basic law is still the premise. What it does is it creates 12 regional reserve banks to eliminate a problem that used to plague America where you'd have regional cash shortages. And it also sets up the Federal Reserve Board, which the Federal Reserve is all board members are appointed by the president. The Federal Reserve Chair is also appointed by the president and approved by Congress. And that is the body that has been very active in the past few weeks, lowering interest rates, increasing money supplies, and helping out businesses during this COVID-19 recession. So all this exists because of the Federal Reserve Act passed in 1913, a pretty monumental, revolutionary piece of legislation. So that's where we'll call it quits in this lecture. Next lecture, we'll pick up with the third wall of privilege, trusts and monopolies, and finish out Woodrow Wilson's first term in office. So I'm going to take a short break. I'll be back in a little bit, and we'll talk more about President Woodrow Wilson. See you soon.